Stephen, it is 6:33, so I think we shouldn't keep our participants waiting any longer. This is exciting.
Well, it's great. It's great to have you all here. It's great to see the numbers growing. And we're excited to be initiating the Suzanne Salvestrin Memorial Lecture Series. St. Helena Historical Society was founded in 2002, and Suzanne was a driving force in helping it grow. And our mission is to collect, preserve, exhibit, interpret, and provide access to the history of St. Helena. And we're excited to be starting this series. Of course, the lecture has been going on for a while, but we really wanted to go back to the beginning of our history here in the Napa Valley and start with the Native Americans. And we're doing that in part because we're also establishing a heritage center. We have 2 rooms in the old Catholic school where we're developing, and when COVID settles down and goes away and we get control, I don't think COVID's going to go away, but when we get control, we will be opening up the Heritage Center and starting with a display of some of artifacts that have been collected here in the Napa Valley. And we are very lucky to have John Holson here to talk with us about those artifacts. He spent a lot of time with them and helped recover them when they were discovered along the riverbanks of the Napa River. So now I'm going to turn it over. So I thank you all for joining us. And I'm going to turn it over to Kathleen Cooling, who is our program director. And I wanted to extend my thanks to Lady Olivier, who is our executive director and who helped pull all this together and is making it happen, and is young enough to be able to manage Zoom. So she will be helping us make it all happen. So Kathleen, would you tell us a little bit more about Suzanne and about the program that we've set up?
Yes, I'd like to thank you all, first of all, for joining us tonight. This is really an exciting evening. Before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone that they should be on mute and stay on mute during the lecture so everyone can hear the speaker. There will be time for Q&A after the presentation, so please hold any questions that you might have until after the end of the presentation. And finally, I'd like to let you all know that we'll be recording this presentation in its entirety, including the Q&A, so that we can post it along with the entire lecture series on our YouTube channel at a later date. So getting on, the purpose of the new Suzanne Salvestrin Memorial Lecture Series is to honor Suzanne's memory by sharing with our community some of the stories of early St. Helena, a community that Suzanne cared about so deeply throughout her life. Suzanne was instrumental in the founding of the St. Helena Historical Society. And as Stephen mentioned, she was the driving force and inspiration for the establishment of our new Heritage Center on Oak Avenue in St. Helena. Because Suzanne was committed to preserving the Native American history of our area, it's fitting that our first lecture is on this topic. Tonight's presentation is by Mr. John Holson, Senior Archaeologist with Pacific Legacy Incorporated. John has more than 30 years of cultural resources management experience in California, Nevada, Hawaii, and Europe, and is widely recognized as an expert in historical preservation. The title of his talk is 10,000 Years of a Changing Cultural Landscape in the Clear Basin and the Napa Valley. Welcome, John, and I'll turn it over for you.
Well, I want to welcome everybody, and I'm surprised. I just kind of flicked down through the list of people, and it's good to see everybody here. There's some old friends and some employees, so hopefully I won't have to hear about this at work tomorrow. But I just want to say I met Suzanne in 2009, I think, and she was very interested in what we were doing for the St. Helena Napa River Restoration Project. And over the years, I'd always get a phone call from her, an email, how's it coming? Can you come up and give a talk? We had quite a bit of an outreach program, but she was really an energetic woman and dedicated to particularly the Native Americans in the Napa Valley and preserving that cultural history. But anyway, tonight, this topic, 10,000 Years of Changing Cultural Landscape in the Clear Lake Basin and Napa Valley. Most of the talks I've given on the Napa Valley have been pretty much just on the archaeology, focusing on those parts of it. But for this one, I decided to kind of contrast and compare Clear Lake and the Clear Lake Basin and Napa Valley in terms of different topics. It is very kind of a broad brush approach. And we're going to hit a little bit on the geology and geomorphology of both areas, the archaeology of both areas, historical narratives from the 19th century, native populations, but focusing again on the Wappo tribe, which inhabited the area, Napa Valley and St. Helena, in how it was a dynamic and changing landscape over the last 10,000 years. I'm totally honored to be the first speaker in the series, honoring Suzanne, and I appreciate you guys inviting me. Well, both the Clear Lake Basin and Napa River are kind of built up on a mosaic of different ecotones, as we call them, and it wasn't really that bad a place to live. You had the oak savanna, marsh, wet meadows, lakes, rivery environment, braided channels along the Napa River. In fact, and it's in this picture right here. You get the clovers and things, although the vegetation has changed quite a bit since prehistoric times, and supported extensive fisheries. And then in the lower Napa Valley, you had extensive marshlands leading into San Pablo Bay. So essentially, it wasn't a bad place to live. You had water, shelter, access, food, and you also had obsidian. So it was somewhat like the French Laundry. It was a varied menu that changed by the season. Pronghorn antelope, tule elk, they're not around anymore, but they were. You have beavers, rabbits, fish, and even the grizzly bear. And all these different mammals and the fish and stuff, we actually find that those the remnants of them in archaeological sites. So let's talk about the Clear Lake Basin first. It was actually formed about 2.5 million years ago, and it actually flowed into the Russian River. Clear Lake did, but then there was a large landslide that dammed up Coal Creek, and it started to empty into the Sacramento Valley via Cache Creek. Here, you had lakeshore and riverine environments. This is a view looking towards Mount Konocti in the background, abundant marshlands. Most of the sites stay to what we call, and there'll be a little discussion later on when I go through the lower archaic, middle archaic, and that's when you might want to, turn off your video, go get a glass of wine, then come back later. But anyway, so most sites date to the lower archaic, 6,000, 3,000, middle archaic, in the upper emergent period, 1500 to 1800 AD. Except for one site, well, there's actually a couple, three sites, but the most famous one is the Borax Lake site in Clear Lake. And it dates to 12,000 to 10,000 BC. And it's actually near the town, right above the town of Clear Lake Oaks. As I mentioned, there was no drainage to the Pacific Ocean now. It drains to the Sacramento Valley. It's moderate climate, fluctuating lakeshore, and importantly, the volcanics. And those of you that are vintners on this lecture know about volcanics and volcanic soil. That included the Borax Lake and Mount Konocti obsidian sources. The lakeshore was made of both alluvial and colluvial sediments, which essentially means one is washing in as the lakeshore fluctuates, and colluvial is coming down from the mountains. Well, let's talk about the obsidian sources because they played a large part in the development of trade and exchange in both basins, the Clear Lake and Napa area. And this is Mount Konocti right here. This is a terrible slide, but the best I could do for this morning when I was putting it together. No, I wasn't for this morning. Anyway, so here's Mount Konocti. Borax Lake is up at the top of the picture right there. And then you had Napa Valley sources, the most famous kind of being Napa Glass Mountain. And these two slides in the middle here, these are the road cuts from the Napa Glass Mountain source, which is just about a mile from mile north of St. Helena. This last picture here is actually in a wine. Sorry, it's not from the St. Helena area, but it's called Estate Obsidian from Arkenstone Wineries. So let's talk a little bit about the Napa Valley. It had a different depositional history. It's more riverine. You have the Napa Valley, the Napa River that flows actually through the valley right here, emptying into San Pablo Bay. It's a river valley with this, an incised stream channel along the Napa River and its tributaries, and it meandered quite a bit. So you find what we're interested at the time when we did the excavations is that the St. Helena site was actually a buried site. So it was buried by alluvium. Nobody knew what was there. There's no firm evidence of sites as old as the Borax Lake site, and the major settlements along the Napa River Terrace. And most sites there date to the Middle Archaic, 3,500 up to the Upper Emergence. But the late Holocene conditions favor more availability of marshland resources, but also the riverine resources here. This here is a map. There may be some Caltrans folks from a study that Caltrans did looking for the probability and the sensitivity for buried sites. You can see in the green here, these are Holocene, that's 10,000-year-old soils that have been deposited. And you can actually, this is a St. Helena area right here, and two of the sites that were found, buried sites, were actually in St. Helena area. So let's talk a little bit about early cultures. The Borax Lake site. When I was at Sonoma State, everybody heard about the Borax Lake site and how cool it was, but it was an amateur archaeologist named Charles Post discovered the site in 1938. He noticed a particular projectile point type that was similar to what we call the pluvial lakes tradition, or some of the older sites found in the Mojave, the desert areas, and usually those were around dried up pluvial lakes. But it was excavated by Harrington from the Southwest Museum in 1938, 1942, 46, and then again in 1946 by Robert Sales. Just based at that point, they didn't have radiocarbon dating or some of the techniques that we have now, but they concluded that the site was some antiquity, possibly 10,000 to 15 years old. The geological formation was considered the Holocene, about 10,000 years old. So the geology really came into play in interpreting the site initially. But in the 70s, with the advance of obsidian hydration dating, 77 of the artifacts, fluted points, at least a third of them had large rim readings suggesting great antiquity. So here's where we sit in our little happy time scale that archaeologists have come up with. The post pattern, that's actually the oldest component at the Borax Lake site. And then you can see how the Borax Lake pattern, and these are based on artifact types and things, kind of influenced the Napa Valley cultural pattern, which is right here. But this is the Borax Lake area right here. So the projectile points of the fluted tradition, most likely used for the Napa ladle thrower. But also there is one site in Napa, Napa 131, where similar artifacts, not as old as the post pattern sites right here, was found. But the trenching in the 1970s indicated the site was on a bed of alluvium with gravel and sand with intrusive layers. They dug a little bit deeper and they found lacustrine clay, which is, kind of it's clay from an old river, an old lake. But but they only found the artifacts, you know, in the layers above. So with a comparison to other dated geological layers, it suggested that it was about 12,000 years BP. So I just want to show you a little slide about the Folsom projectile points, and these are actually from Harrington's descriptions of them from his actual report. And this is the flute right here, what we call them fluted points, right here. So they would make a channel using, you know, some type of percussion, hammer, soft hammer, I'm not sure, on one side of it, and then the other side had a little fluting, but not as much. But these points, looking over this picture right here, are pretty distinctive, and so they're compared to Folsom sites, which is actually a Paleo-Indian site in the Midwest, Colorado, I think. But anyway, these have all been dated. So you can see these projectile points right here are all they call from Paleo-Indian sites during what they call, well, right before the Holocene period. So let's talk a little bit about the Napa Valley sites. The late Holocene conditions favor availability and use of marshland resources as the weather stabilized. Weather has changed over the years from about 800 to about 880 to I think about 1300. There was a climatic anomaly that there was warming. Then there was a little bit after that. It was called the Little Ice Age that persisted to about 1800. But it was fairly stable there. The settlements were mainly along the Napa River. Some of the archaeology indicates that large mammals were preferred over smaller mammals. You also got coastal species, clamshells and abalone in the stuff. And then later on in time, groundstone tools support the processing of acorns. And processing technology involves leaching, but that was predominantly in the Upper Archaic. Early on, it was more large mammals and stuff. So here's a distribution of just a few sites in the Napa Valley. The red dots are where St. Helena is, but from all different time periods. So I just want to show you a little happy slide here about it's not as clean and pretty excavating as, there, whoops. God, I was on a roll there for a while. Okay, so anyway, sediment context is really important. This is actually out at Oak Knoll, and you can see in the upper layers here, this is what we call the cultural deposit, and then you get fine grained clays and things like that. So that's what we look at when we're out, you know, excavating and things like that. So this is just to kind of show you a sampling of the artifacts that we actually collected from the St. Helena site. There was a cache of bifaces, and these are all up here. Presumably, they're unfinished. You can see on this one right here, and on some of the other ones, the gray spots. That's what we call cortex. These all date to the Middle Archaic. These right here, they're serrated. You can see the little edges on them. That's a latent time, and it doesn't. This type of projectile point doesn't get up into the Clear Lake Basin at all. It's kind of, and that's up here what we call the Augustine Pattern. These were first recognized in the Sacramento Valley, but they may have been manufactured and shipped out from the Napa Valley. And then you get some bone and stone tools, mortar, and then you get what are called charm stones. We also got work boned, bird bone whistles, bone awls. Here's some beads, bird bone beads, things like that. So there was a wide variety of stuff. Not all sites in the Napa Valley as rich as this one, but there are. One interesting thing about this site is that there was a burial component, and the Wappo tribe allowed us to radiocarbon date several of the burials. And you can see in this line right here that they're all within, say, a 500, 750 year period, which is, I mean, it was quite unusual. We didn't expect that, except for one, and it's this outlier up here, that the burial accompaniments had trade beads with it. So, and those dates at the date was AD 1770 to 1830. So, and this kind of coincides with the mission period. And that was one of the surprising finds. So, as I showed you, the French laundry potpourri, we found quite a bit. This is a grizzly bear humerus that we found. Then there's a deer humerus, and those are cut marks on there where it was either, you know, when they were processing it, they cracked it and probably took out the marrow and stuff. But we did find quite a bit. Not all sites have this kind of preservation. So going back to, now this is the part where you can go get your glass of wine. So the first demonstrated entry of humans that we see is about from 10,000 to 6,000 BC. And there's actually a couple sites, but the most famous site is the Borax Lake site. But this period remains little understood. It's associated with the Post pattern, which is named after Charles Post, the man who located the Borax Lake site. We don't have any sites like this in the Napa Valley. It's characterized by the fluted projectile points that I showed you, flake crescents, which are like little crescents. I should have thrown a picture in, and a certain type of single-shouldered point. But it was hypothesized the period was characterized by lacustrine sites with a probable hunting emphasis, but no evidence of milling technologies such as groundstone and mortars and pestles. But Dave Fredrickson from Sonoma kind of hypothesized that trade and exchange is probably on an individual basis, and other resources such as salt and things like that were required through mobility rather than trade. The lower archaic period here, this one right here, because of the climatic change in ancient lakes, fluvial lakes, lacustrine environment started to dry up. This wasn't so much a problem with the Clear Lake because you had Clear Lake. But then you also have the appearance of milling slabs, which are used for grinding hard seeds and things like that. I say things like that a lot. I shouldn't do that. But anyway, milling slabs and other equipment associated with it. It was initially identified at the Borax Lake site, and the local variant of the pattern in the Clear Lake Basin is known as the Borax Lake aspect. There have been at Napa 131 some artifacts that are similar to the Borax Lake pattern, but probably from a later date. The Middle Archaic period, 3000 to 500 BC, is actually better well known because you have, with the advent of radiocarbon dating, and there's actually more sites. And you have chronologically controlled assemblages, so we were able to date them a little bit better. You also see the intensification of what's called the Acorn Economy, as typified by bull mortars and other artifacts, and the development of an acorn-based economy. And then because, and I've always kind of called it tethered nomadism, but it really isn't. But if you have the acorn economy, you're talking about storage and other such things, over periods of time. And because of the leaching, you have to be near a water source and things like that. So they feel that during this period, there was a rise in sedentism, due to the fact of a changing pattern of subsistence. And the St. Helena site actually is a good, strong example of a Middle Archaic burial component, although the later components, the Upper Emergence, is still represented. So in the Upper Archaic period, you see a general trend towards increased population growth and continued expansion of settlements with more sites of that age. Mortars and pestles dominate the groundstone assemblage, so there's a fully developed acorn economy. Stone tools, a little bit different, but still more in the spear point range. And then you see an increase in olivella beads, abalone ornaments, which are actually from coastal, from the coast. They're ocean invertebrates. And then also a little more complexity in the bone artifacts and stuff. And finally, the last period is the Lower Emergence, or the Emergent period, AD 900 to 1800. And that's when most people think that the bow and arrow was introduced. So they didn't always have the bow and arrow. Territorial boundaries seem to become well established. Regularized exchange networks flourished. Borax Lake obsidian was traded more towards the north, and while Napa glass obsidian was more traded to the south into the Bay Area, and actually into the Central Valley. And I've actually worked with sites in Monterey where we've gotten small amounts. And they actually replaced the Napa glass. I always felt that it was kind of the knives, forks, and spoons. In the Bay Area, you do get obsidian artifacts manufactured from sources in the Central Sierras, but it kind of drops out a little bit. And you also see in the Upper Emergence, specialization in manufacturing increases, which is applicable to the obsidian source, because we feel that a lot of the blanks that we find are being traded out. So that's it for the archaeology. Hope you went and got your glass of wine. Now I've talked a little bit about the native peoples, and well, how do we know about them? Well, we have, as I said, the archaeological record, so we're able to piece that together, and based on dating and artifacts and things like that. But there is a body of written evidence. One of the more famous folks was a 19th century ethnographer named Alfred Lewis Kroeber. He was actually an anthropologist. He wasn't considered an archaeologist. He was under Franz Boas, who was another anthropologist at the time, and at Columbia University, where he received his doctorate in 1901. And he was the first doctorate at Columbia. And then in 1901 to 1946, when he retired, he was the first instructor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of California in Berkeley. One of his most seminal publications is the Handbook of Indians of California, which actually covers all of California. It's quite I'll show you. It's quite the well-worn book. And you don't want to read this before you go to bed. But anyway, this book kind of covers a lot of tribes, most of the tribes in California. But it also includes the Clear Lake Basin and the Napa area, particularly the Wappo. But in the book itself, only 3 pages are devoted to the Wappo. So it's a little bit skimpy on what when I looked at it, I thought, oh, but it's a good source. There was another person, one of Kroeber's students. He embarked on a more ambitious program to record the native cultures in the Clear Lake Basin in the north, the coast, Napa Valley, and Marin County. He conducted field work in 1903, 04, and 06, and published, I think it was in 38, the ethnogeography of the Pomo and their neighbors, which is actually a very good text. It's a little bit more specific. But he also, as I said, talked about the Wappo, and they were associated linguistically and discussed with the Yuki, whose main area was to the north in Mendocino County. The Wappo, as you can see from the map here, you kind of divided them into western, northern, central, southern, and then you had a group up here along Coal Creek, remnants of the Wappo linguistic, but also Wappo peoples up along the Coal Creek drainage there. But you could also see that they were surrounded by the Wintun, the Lake Miwok, Central Pomo, and Coast Miwok groups. So looking at the ethnographic territory for the Wappo, this map here, we've superimposed it. There are the 4 groups right here. St. Helena is, oh, everything got moved around. Anyway, St. Helena is right in here. And then here are some of these little black squares of the different ethnographic villages that were recorded by Barrett in the 30s. And you see a couple villages in the Clear Lake area, but there's about 16 different villages in the Napa Valley area. The 2 that I meant to point out with these happy arrows was the Kiama right here down near Yountville, and the Anactama Noma near St. Helena. And these were actually the 2 largest villages that had been recorded. An early Spanish expedition in 1823 had an encounter with the Wappo, where they were talking about how the Wappo gave them presents of food. With the coming of Vallejo and the colonization of the Napa Valley by the Spaniards, there were conflicts in 1834, 1836, and 1842, and there was actually 2 separate treaties. And this is where the Wappo actually joined with the Pomo in fending off Vallejo's soldiers. So the Wappo as a language, I think I've mentioned this, belongs to a small family of 4 languages, including Yuki, Coast Yuki, and Huchinon. Wappo is different from the other 3, probably in part to the influence of surrounding tribes such as Pomo. And in the 1970s, a linguistic analyst from, I think, Berkeley, Whistler, talked about the Pomo Wappo words that were very similar and stuff. Spanish actually crept into the Wappo vocabulary. There is, I think it was published in the early 1940s, there's actually a Wappo dictionary. And I may be wrong, but the last Wappo speaker, I think, was Laura Comasil. And I tried to look it up to see if I could get the correct citation, but there was a Pomo speaker into the 1940s. But another UC Berkeley person, L. Dorff, he suggested, a linguist, suggested the separation of Wappo from other Yukian speakers at, around 1000 BC. The Wappo were kind of characterized in both ethnographies as being a fairly peaceful person. The name is derived from the Spanish guapo, which means brave or conqueror, but they don't have they didn't have that reputation. The last traditional village recorded was recorded in 1936 near Geyserville, and that had 11 houses. The picture here, this is of the Wappo Rancheria in Alexander Valley, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. And with the houses of, at some point there was, during the turn of the century, there was 14 families that lived there, but by the 1930s, there was only 2. So the Wappo Rancheria of Alexander Valley. It's about in the Alexander Valley of Healdsburg on the Russian River. In 1909 and 1913, land was purchased for the Wappo by the federal government, and the Wappo Rancheria was established on 54 acres. Here's another house that was photographed by Seahart Marion during the century of one of the houses there on the reservation. One characteristic about the reservation is that the population fluctuated as there was seasonal work in the growing agricultural areas and viniculture trade that was growing up at that time period. The Wappo descendants today are primarily descendants of the 1935 census. But up into 1810, most of the tribelets in the North Bay were relatively untouched by Spanish missionization efforts, unlike groups to the south. So let's talk a little bit about federal recognition. Well, in 1934, Congress passed the Indian Reorganization Act. And in 1935, 14 adults on the Rancheria voted to accept the Indian Reorganization Act and become known as the Michigan Wappo tribe of Alexander Valley. 2 parcels were purchased. So with the Reorganization Act, it reorganized you in a different category. But in 1959, under the California Rancheria Act, members voted in favor of termination of the reservation. And from the legal accounts that I read, there was only 2 people that actually voted for that. But then in August of 1961, the Michigan Wappo tribe of Alexander Valley was terminated, which means they didn't have federal recognition. But in 2009 to 2018, the current Michigan Wappo tribe applied for reinstatement due to improper termination. This was ruled against them and based on the fact that the statute of limitations has run out. So essentially, they're not a federally recognized tribe right now. I'm not sure if they're going to keep trying for it or what. But under California law, the Native American Heritage Commission in Sacramento recognizes them as a California tribe. And the recent California legislation, it's called AB 52, you have to consult with those tribes and consider tribal resources when you're preparing your environmental document. So it doesn't hold the weight. With federal recognition, you're considered at the same par as the United States, same level as the United States. You're a sovereign state, so that it's a government-to-government kind of consultation. Without the federal recognition, it doesn't hold as much weight. So let's go through. I know you guys are excited all about this. Some events that changed the culture, the native landscape, excuse me for a minute. The native landscape. So in 1823, with the selection of Mission San Francisco de Solano, Petaluma, it's the northern frontier of Spanish influence. You also had to the north, one of the reasons the missions moved up there was to ward off the Ross colony up at Fort Ross, the Russian influence. In 1833, Vallejo was given the Rancho Petaluma and granted the right to give grants to other ranchos in the North Bay. So in 1836, one of the first land grants was granted to George Yount, E.G. Yountville, the Rancho Cayumas. Another drastic event was a smallpox epidemic, which wiped out native populations throughout the state in 1837, and in particular the Bay Area and to the north. 1841, Rancho Carne Humana was granted to Dr. Edward Bale. And there's an interesting story because Carne Humana means something effective. They were wondering if he was a surgeon, if the name is like human meat, and why would you name Rancho human meat? But anyway, I'm sure there's a story behind it. I don't know it, but I just thought it was interesting. By 1843, Native Americans were noted as a large labor force. There's some figures: 100 on the Bale Rancho, 400 at Yuma, 600 at the Salvador Rancho, and others throughout the North Coast. These weren't all Wappo, but certainly the Wappo were part of that. Then in 1850, California received statehood, and Napa became one of the original 27 counties. In 1867, Lake County was formed from the northern county. And then again in 1876, St. Helena was incorporated as a town. But the Mission-Wall Wappo tribe still persisted up until, now there's a very viable and active community. So I didn't go through all the history. You can look at this map and you can see some of the Charles Krug. I think this is from early 19th century. It's an older one, but I forgot to write down the date. But anyway, Charles Krug, St. Helena is right here. You can see who owned all of these parcels and stuff like that. And heavily impacting the changing landscape, the natural landscape, was the introduction of agriculture, and particularly viticulture. So, having said all that, what does it mean? Well, Native Californian societies have been evolving over the last 12,000 years in the Clear Lake Basin, and for at least 5,000 years in the Napa Valley. That's a lot of time. And some things that we don't think about when we talk about Native California populations. Since the Borax Lake site was located, it's believed that settlement of California may have been as early as 30,000. And that's kind of based on when kind of a two-pronged approach to settlement of the coast of California. I think it's Daisy Cave on the San Miguel Island, Channel Islands, has one of the oldest dates, about 30,000. And then further, when you get further down the coast, down to Chile, you get sites that are 30,000. But the Borax Lake site is still important in, prehistory. So the depth of the time period allowed for diversification of material culture. We see projectile points, types changing, beads changing, solidification of extensive trade and exchange networks, particularly with the obsidian trade and exchange. It became more regularized, I guess, would be an approach. And you find it in later period sites throughout the Bay Area, Central California. You see population migration and expansion. Pomo is, I hate to kind of say it's a little bit later date. They're not Yukian speakers. They speak a different language, and some linguistic analysts have said that there was the Pomo intrusions or Athabascan speakers moving in. So there's kind of a give and take with migration and expansion. And you also see the development of more complex social organizations. So the term's always been hunter-gatherer, but you also see probably more social stratification and is identified through burial goods as you get later in time. One thing that was different between the Clear Lake Basin and the Napa Valley was that artifact types were different. So those little serrated points that I showed you earlier, they're very different from the Clear Lake later projectile points, what they call the Clear Lake aspect, but they're little corner notch points without serrations. So there is reasonable diversification between Clear Lake Basin and the Napa Valley. We also see the native peoples were able to adapt within the context of their cultural landscapes to changing climates and the impact on local flora and fauna regimes. But by this I mean there was a series of pollen cores taken up in the North Coast ranges, and they found that vegetation moved up and down the slopes, depending on the climate and things like that. And this is over long periods of times. So when you're able to date the pollen cores, so you might find pine pollen at whatever date, and then that's replaced by oak or oak savanna species, and then pine revegetates again. The one thing about Kroeber and the other anthropologists, although they were very important, they did not capture the extent of lifeways, but rather a memory culture. And that's one criticism of Kroeber, that when they did their studies, they would go and talk to elders. So what you were getting is maybe what your grandfather, grandmother, the elders told you, oral tradition, and other things. So it wasn't really going back too many generations in time. But still, it was important what he did. When I was doing my thesis, I used, in the 30s and 40s, he had these things called the culture element distribution lists. And they were just laundry lists of the artifact types that people used. So they would go and talk to someone up in, this was up in Round Valley, at the Round Valley Reservation. And they would say, hey, what do you use for this? What do you use for that? But by that time, they were using knives, forks, and spoons, but they were trying to get traditional things that folks still use. But still an important contribution. So with Euro-American colonization came rapid change of settlement and subsistence strategies with constrained access to tribal lands and dramatic changes to tribal culture. So, I mean, essentially what that says, I probably could have said it simpler, is that they couldn't roam about as freely as they had. They were confined to certain specific areas, rancherias, or not so much assimilated, but lived on like the Bale Rancho or wherever they were. So their whole tribal structure, as they knew it, was broken down. They couldn't just, as with land ownership, they couldn't just go to their traditional hunting grounds, or and a lot of the vegetation was replaced by barley, wheat, and then in the vineyards. So there was quite a dramatic change in the late period. Well, that's about it for me. I just want to say thanks to the St. Helena Historical Society Board for asking me to speak tonight. It's always a pleasure to work with you guys. I want to tip of the glass to Letty Olivier for arranging this, and especially her persistence in making me do this, and the exhibit that she so hard and diligently has been working on. I just want to give a shout out that I don't know when it's going to open, but as Kathleen and Letty have mentioned, they have a new facility at 1255 Oak Street, St. Helena. I had the opportunity to visit it, have a look. Very nice. Encourage people to go there, drop in, leave a little money in the donation box. And then I've also, sorry, Letty, I hope that didn't embarrass you guys.
No. I think most importantly, I'm seeing quite a few questions come over that I think are very important that we need to touch on and discuss. Okay. But I think more important than anything, I want to share with those that are still on our lecture, on our meeting, is that this is the first in a series of lectures we would like to host and engage in. We strongly believe at the Historical Society that our Historical Society and Heritage Center are definitely more about the people and the stories. And the artifacts are great because it gives us something, especially with the younger generation, to look at and to understand and connect with. However, it is important to get the voices heard. I do see, first we're gonna start with Susquehanna. I'm not sure who is on from Susquehanna Intertribal Council, and they have a very interesting point, and I'm so sorry. I almost feel as if my apology may be an empty one because I wouldn't have known any other way. And so she asked, or she stated, or they stated that it's sad that we are perpetuating the Euro myths. And I've got to say that these are the kinds of lectures that are going to encourage open communication and open dialogue. So I hope that everyone present can listen with open eyes and open ears and open heart, open mind. So I do apologize that this presentation has come across that way. I'm sorry. I personally wouldn't have known. Something about it's a made up name for the tribe. We did seek, the statement is, unfortunately, you did not seek to consult the living tribes of survivors of Euro. Oh, did you unmute?
I'm unmuted. This is Charlie Toledo.
Hey, Charlie, this is Letty. So I did reach out to Scott multiple times because I wish we could have had him on this present conversation. I'm not sure if he doesn't care to. Anyway, I've not heard from him, but I do understand that John and Scott have communicated on several occasions and have worked together on other projects, not this particular one with our presentation, but we do hope to hear his voice in the fall. And I'm sorry we made it.
So what I was going to say, just that there's 21 tribes, you know, in Lake and Mendocino and Sonoma County, the survivors from the valley that mostly intermarried with the Pomo tribes. There's many, many tribes within a 50-mile radius, 21 tribes, not just that one person. So I up there.
And that's where I definitely show my ignorance. And this is why I'm so thrilled to have people that joined us today so that we can learn these sort of things. I did approach this presentation with the vision of reaching out. Am I saying it correctly? Mishawa?
Yes.
Mishawa tribe? Okay, so
Wappo was a made-up name, and the tribe was, the reason it got extinct is because the ethnographers who came, they said, "Are you Wappo?" And of course, the response to that was no. And the people were not working, they were slaves. There was a Euro invasion. And the people that he's listing as being employed or whatever, they were slaves. They were against their will. And so it's just that shade. But I know this is the first outreach, and I appreciate it, but it would be nice to have it, you know, that there are 21 tribes within.
I apologize for not. I tried to focus it on the Wappo. It was a lot to cover, and I really tried to stay away from coaching it in terms of
the tribes,
Euro-American dominance.
Right. And the tribes themselves the tribe here is Onisaki. And there's a lot of documentation about that, even on that mural. But there were 3 tribes, not just the Mishwa Wappo. Yeah. The Patwin and the Miwok were tribes in the valley. Their tribal territories were here. But that's a long story. I didn't mean to disrupt. I just wanted to make the comment.
No. We don't apologize. We definitely welcome the dialogue and the exchange because this is the only way, one, we can grow and learn and open our frame of mind, our current, present, point of where we are. And I am going to leak a little of our future presentations. Of course, we know that November is Native American Heritage Month. And so we do hope, John, I was going to ask you to come back out, but with some of the tribal council representatives that may be either in the area or can at least join us via Zoom or something. So it's the first in many. We would like to continue these conversations because it's very important to us as a society that we hear your voices, hear the stories, and make it encompass all of us here who have been here, who have a history here. And so I'm going to go back to, I hope I answered your question, Robin. You asked about how to pronunciate it. And then something about applied to all the different triplets according to Lowe. I'm not quite sure if you want to unmute, Robin. You're more than welcome to, Robin Orsini.
My typing wasn't great. My understanding, I understand that some of the descendants have asked that Wappo be exchanged, and for the indigenous name. And all I could find was, of course, not talking to any of these descendants, was Mishawal or Missawal. And I see that we have Mishawal, Wappo Rancheria up north. And I was asking Charlie if she knew if all of the tribelets that were in this area and throughout actually would be identified, would they self-identify as Missawal or Mishawal? I know there was a town that was Midistal, and I'm just confused and wanting to know what you know.
Well,
No, I was asking Charlie, John.
oh,
I'm sorry. First,
All right, this
because
is
she
Charlie.
brought it up.
Right, I'll defer to the speaker. But the Mishawal and it's Mitsawal, those were
Missawal, thank you.
Onisati people. Mishawal wasn't a tribe, it was a band. And tribelet is a Euro word, a Eurocentric term. The tribes, there were, in California, there were over 300 tribes before the Euro invasions. And they all had names for themselves, and they still do. They're still a living people. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. There's not, that maybe there's one person or one unrecognized tribe, but there's many, many survivors from the Euro invasions and the genocides that occurred here. And now the governor and everyone is finally using the word genocide. That's what happened. And you can look that up, Google it. And the tribes have their own names for themselves. And just because the tribes were so disrupted, 300 tribes were shrunk to about 95 tribes in 25 years or 50 years of Euro. So that qualifies by most terms as a genocide. And so a lot of the people do not want to interface with the descendants or the people that are benefiting from those genocides. But it's Mishawal, the tribe, one of the tribes, the predominant tribe in the valley was Onisati. And the southern part was the Patwin, was actually the largest tribe in the Napa Valley. They are still a federally recognized tribe. They got pushed up into Chico. And then the Miwok, the Federated Rancheria, they're descendants from this valley too. So, just when you're researching the information, but I don't want to, I didn't intend.
Thank you so much.
You cut out at the end, Charlie, so I didn't catch it, but I do thank you for jumping in and entertaining that question. I'm moving down the list, and how are these narratives accepted by the local tribes? I can't answer that. I don't know that, John, you can answer that. And why is it not a history told by Indigenous people? We would love that. This was a little backstory on how this lecture was put together, or how I approached it was, we were aware, obviously, of the dig that happened here in St. Helena off of Pope Street. And we had some archaeological findings. And so I thought it would be interesting to bring John in and talk about those. And in the short few months that I've been hired, I only had Scots. I didn't think beyond the immediate tribe, so I do apologize. And so I had only reached out to him, and I thought that was the way to best approach this presentation, this series, or this lecture itself. But it is not the one and only. So I would absolutely, I'm not sure, Alvin, you mentioned, or I think you typed in this question or statement. As I've mentioned before.
Sorry to interject. No, it's one of those learning curves. And as Charlie pointed out, one of those major things that we're learning day in, day out is that communication, open communication, and reaching out to these Indigenous groups and peoples that know the actual history and seeing it through their perspective balances the academic side of things too. And I think that's super highly important for discussions such as these.
Absolutely. And it's why I thought to reach out to Suskel, because I thought, I don't know that it's only the Mishawal and Scott, the representative. I sent her blindly an email and said, actually, I sent it to the Intertribal Council email address and said, hope you'll join us. This is what we're trying to do. And I'm looking, our organization is absolutely looking at creating open dialogue. And like I said, we're about the people, the humanity, the history, the cultural essence that we can't necessarily touch. And then I do believe, I mean, I was born and raised here. We absolutely have a void in that. And so I'm glad you joined us. I'm not sure if you're with if you're native. I don't think we've met. So I'm glad you joined us and that you'll hopefully join in future conversations as well. I'm going to scroll. Go ahead, John.
Well, I just want to say that it hasn't, in my experience, we've worked with different, I haven't worked with Sesco, but I've worked with different groups up there. And sometimes I don't feel that they would, it's a very personal thing, and I get more talking story, I guess, just sitting around and going up and asking. But the fact that I think in the last maybe 5 or 6 years, they're, particularly through Kent Lightfoot at Berkeley, you're seeing a much more holistic approach to colonization and you know, of Native Americans, particularly during the mission period at Mission Santa Clara. Some of Sim Schneider's work out in Marin County and stuff like that. So it's creeping into the literature, but and I recognize totally that Kroger and the way he did things was, at the time, was the Tribal Society was one of his constructs. Charlie, you're certainly correct about that. And they didn't really, I think a lot of it had to do is they didn't actually live with the people that they studied. They just went in and asked questions, and they were laundry lists, but still, you know, at the same time, valuable information. Okay.
So from Ellen, John, I'm probably not saying that right, from SSU. Can you comment on the numbers of Native Americans, the populations based on volumes of artifacts discovered in the Napa Lake region population during the most recent Holocene period, say 3000 to 500 BC? I realize we have more information based on written texts of Spanish and census derived from that. Did you get that all?
Yeah, no, I haven't done anything with population estimates. I mean, it was highly populated, and a lot of it is based on some of the burial, the early 1950s and 60s excavations of burials, where you have large populations, but in my opinion, if you go, I suppose you could do statistical analysis on the number of sites and things like that, but then if sites were visited sporadically, it would skew that. So the short answer is no, but I've thought about it a bit.
Okay.
But
And
if you have an answer, let me know.
So Alex, thanks to you, John, for the broad overview. And perhaps the speaker series could include Indigenous voices to speak to their own history. Absolutely, it is one of my driving wishes to see a more encompassing, kind of a more fulfilled historical heritage center. So count on it. Absolutely sign up for our emails, because I'm not sure how you got these emails or this particular lecture series email. You may not be on our list, but absolutely do sign up. Let's see, there is a question, a couple of the,
Can I
go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say that in the last lecture that we did, you know, Scott and I forget who the other guy was, Earl Coey, when he was still alive, both came in and gave talks before we talked on the archaeology. So we have done something similar like that. It just didn't happen.
Yeah. And then, so Miriam has a question. When was the settlement of Onakota, Noma abandoned?
There was no dates of when it was abandoned, but it was in, you know, it was in, as I said, the memory of whoever they interviewed. So it would probably be, so that was 1903, maybe 2 or 3 generations back. And that's just speculation though.
Okay. And Miriam, you can go ahead.
But
and
again, you have to also take into consider, sorry,
No, it's
oral
okay.
tradition. So oral traditions, you know, you can't really put a date on those. So I have no idea if they were, you know, if someone said, hey, my great grandparents lived there, or if it was an oral tradition about the village.
And Miriam, you had a share, Carne Humana.
Yes, I've read that the word carne humana is derived from the word cala romana.
I don't, is that, do we have anyone that can confirm that? Where did you read that in one of the most recent publications or?
I think it was one from 1881.
Okay, so growing up, I always thought it meant carne humana means human skin in Spanish. So I thought it had something to do with the Spaniard invasion. But I personally have never researched it. So that's an interesting one. If anyone has. So Alvin.
I've raised my hand. What I remember is that, you know, there were little bands of people, sometimes just a family or two families together. And up near where Bale Mill is now, up in that area, there was a group called, I don't know if it was Calle Mana, but Mano is village.
Mana.
And so they couldn't pronounce it. It's just like Wappo from Guapo, which meant handsome or brave. So, you know, people couldn't understand even the Spanish. And so they named this Indian name. They said the closest they could get in Spanish was Carne Humana. And it was a joke. It literally was a joke. So it was named after the indigenous small band there, but just, you know,
And I see that,
bad
and I
thing.
see that Alvin Rosa shared it. The translation is human flesh.
Yes, yes, it is human meat. Carne is meat, but it's just a joke. It was just a play on what they heard. Okay.
Well, what I did when I ran across some research, and I don't think people could understand why he named it that way, and they associated it that he was a surgeon. So, I mean, that's what I've read.
And then,
But there's many narratives, so.
I just wanted to say that, John, your map was from 1876.
Which one?
The map, the old map with the yellowish color that you showed along top of the vineyard picture.
Might have been.
Yes, it was.
Oh, thank you.
Believe me. Yes. Also, I've heard that there are burial mounds in Angwin and in around Pope Valley. Do you have any information about that?
Burial. Well, there's. Yes, there probably are. I don't know if they're mounds. I haven't really worked in Pope Valley. One of the effects of colonization was flattening of the earth, and so a lot of the mounds are redistributed. You see that mainly in the Bay Area where we have 28-foot high mounds that are gone now. But I'm sure that there are burial mounds there. Or burial sites. I'm not sure if they're mounds.
Yeah, well, I've talked to people who've seen them. So, you know,
Cool.
Depends on if you're an expert or not, what you're looking at, what you're going to call it.
interesting. Not sure. Now, I do have a question from Tom here. He's wondering about tribal boundaries in East Napa County, Pope Valley, and up to the county line. But you just mentioned that you haven't done too much. Did you say in Pope Valley? John?
Let me see if I can pull up my map again.
Okay. And while you're doing that, I also have Shannon asking, there's a thought that Bale waggishly turned the native term into a pun because it sounded like human flesh, as Robin just said. So you've read or have heard the same or similar. It sounds like, and I think that being that we're down to about 45 or 50 participants, I'm going to go ahead and welcome you to unmute yourselves. And if there's a nice pause, go ahead and feel free to ask your question, because I don't want you to have to wait through the queue, because some of the comments are just thanking us, and I want to get to your real questions as well. So how do graduate students get involved with the Historical Society? While you're looking for your information, John, I'm going to answer that. Absolutely reach out to me. My contact number is 707-494-1255, or you may email me at Letty, LETI.shstory@gmail.com. And we are just beginning to put together an application. It's more so just so we have contact information, that sort of stuff. But we definitely absolutely welcome volunteers, and that goes for all departments. So feel free to share my information. Okay, did you find that info on Polk Valley?
If this is the map you were talking about, then this is actually from Kroeber, 1925. There's another map from S.A. Barrett, 1936, but I tried to take a photo of it, but the map is it's huge. But this one illustrated what I was trying to talk about. So you have Polk Valley up in here. And what was the question again?
There's a thought, or wait, sorry.
Mary.
Wondering about the tribal boundaries in East Napa County, Polk Valley, and up to county line.
So, well, on this map, Polk Valley is central Wappo, but the Wintu are over there as well. The thing about these maps is boundaries were fluid. I mean, and this is just a point in time when somebody asks someone a question. So, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. There could be ancestral or oral traditions that, talk about, other people's being there. So when it was recorded by Kroeber, it had it as, Polk Valley was Wappo. But let me see if I can check the other map real quick.
Okay, and I've lost my chat. Thank you for everyone being patient, because this is our first Zoom with this many participants. Actually, my own personal first Zoom with this many participants. So keeping up on everyone's posts is a little bit of a challenge here. And then while you're doing that, can you also talk, John? I have a question for you. Or for anyone else that can answer, is Achochimi, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, a name associated with Wappo people? It's in Wikipedia. Maybe Charlie knows, or someone else knows. I don't know if I'm saying that right. ASHOCHIMI. Is that associated with the Wappo? I don't know. We may have lost Charlie.
So how do you spell it?
ASHOCHIMI. And this is still recording, so I believe I get to get a transcript or something of your questions. So if we do have a question that's not answered in this talk, we will follow it up in our newsletter. So be sure that you have, if you're a member, obviously you'll get the newsletter. If not, I will do my best to email you.
So is that a place name or?
Tom, can you join in on the conversation? I don't know if, yeah, Tom, can you unmute yourself? Oops. He may not have a microphone, I'm not sure.
No, okay. Yeah, I'm not familiar with it. I mean, I don't know all the names by heart.
Okay, so I'll have to get back to you, Tom, on that. Okay, so I answered about students. Bucky, you said yes, but I'm not sure if that was to the getting involved. Let's see, Samantha, also graduate student, Sonoma State. Can I confirm that your email was letty.shstory@gmail.com? Correct. And if you need my number, it's 707-494-1255. And any other questions? I may have missed a raised hand. we were down to about 40 people. I would suggest that if you have a question for us, for John, or the Historical Society, that you can unmute yourself and just go ahead and ask.
So this is Steve Taplin. John, could you just orient me a little bit more? What was the size of the native population? Do we know anything about the size of the population in the valley at its peak and what it is now?
Well, the Wappo was around 1,000 or so, but that was Krober's estimates, which may not be entirely accurate. By 1823, I think they were down to 500. I haven't looked at census records. There are census, and some of it's based on mission records as well. How many Wappo were baptized at Solano? They had 200 something at Mission Dolores in San Francisco.
Wow.
So I thought I may have edited something out about the population estimates. But again, those are based on, the census counts and that are all turn of the century. So at the time of contact, I mean, those are just estimates.
John, I have a question. Why are we not finding any Wappo basketry? Did it just disintegrate, or was there none?
It's perishable. There are Wappo baskets, I'm pretty sure, in museums, and maybe even the Phoebe Hearst. But I got the artifacts up there. Most of the, people have estimated you may see like maybe 10% of the material culture. We don't, not that I know of it, we don't have like, the rugs, the sandals or shoes or tule shoes or, those types of things that were perishable. I've actually excavated a house on a rancheria up in Mendocino County, and again, it was we didn't find. It was only about 150 years old, but we didn't find that much in the way of perishable items and stuff. So a lot of it has to do with the acidity of soil and things like that. Arid environments like a cave, you'd find things like that. If it's, if the climate and the temperature and everything is appropriate. But I haven't found, basketry. I'm trying to think. In some of the Central Valley sites, they have found it. Even where you get layers of beads, where it's obviously it was sewn onto something, you don't get the actual cloth. You get things called Tinklers, which are little obsidian kind of shaped items. They're about maybe 2 or 3 inches long in their shape, and they were used as necklaces. And there's ethnographic accounts. Ethnographic specimens that were collected. But when you find them, you may find 3 or 4 together in a little bundle, but you actually don't find the leather or whatever tied them around their neck. So perishable items don't really, survive.
I've been to the Grace Hudson in Ukiah, and I never know Wappo baskets there. They're all Pomo or other.
Yeah, back in the day, I went to England to look at Vancouver, collected some baskets. So I went to the British Museum. But they were from Monterey, from a stop in Monterey. But there's an active, like the Kashaya Pomo have an active, it's called the Native California Basket Weavers Guild. So there's still an active program with basket weaving, but we just don't see that in the archaeological, or I haven't seen it in the archaeological area.
Great. Any other questions?
Jonathan Eastman. I'm just wondering if there are other resources, books to look at that would be helpful to give us a general background, not only of the archaeology, but some of the oral histories that have been mentioned already.
Yeah, I would, Barrett's book, again, it's a very static interpretation. As Charlie pointed out, it's from, you know, a European point of view. So I'm not sure if it's in print. I think one, the other one is Smithsonian Institute Handbook of California Indians, Volume 8. That covers all of California. There's UC Berkeley Ethnology series. There was 3 different publications by UC Berkeley back in the 30s and 40s and 50s. The Scott Wappo Dictionary. And I think there's some ethno-linguistic notes on the Yuki and Wappo. But it's kind of like, it's all lumped in like Barrett's book. You know, it's more extensive, and it talks about specific, little more specific than Kroeber's book. But it's pretty much summarized in by William Wallace in the Handbook.
Are those, is it possible we could get that list of references?
Yeah, I can send it to you. You know, I was going to put those up, but I decided the Kent Lightfoot book that I showed, it was written with Otis Parrish. He's a Kashaya Pomo. And there's a great section in the front of it. It can be used as a field guide because there's you know, different plant species, animals, mammals, things like that. There I go, things like that again. But and those are correlated to different tribes. But the introduction to the book is really good about talking about how attitudes have changed, particularly as Charlie pointed out. You know, the tribe concept. That was a Kroeber construct, which wasn't really dealt with until the 1960s. Bill Simmons at UC Berkeley and other anthropologists started saying, "Hey, you know, these are European constructs that are being imposed on a social organization, the Native peoples." So I would recommend, you know, if you want to go to the original sources, Kroeber has some stuff, but Kroeber also has. I mean, I talked about Wappo, but you can see from the map, there was the Pomo, Lake Miwok, a lot of different tribes in the surrounding areas. And I think the approach was that, you know, we'll go up to, you know, Round Valley. And I noticed with the culture element distributions list, you know, they would interview people that had been commingled for, you know, 60 or 70 years, and, you know, and also coupled with a loss of identity and all that. So, did I answer your question?
It's a good start. Yeah, list, if you could send a list to Letty, that'd be great, that she could disseminate.
And
I'd
then,
appreciate that.
thank you. And then Bucky is sharing that Stephen Power's 19th century work has material on Napa as well. So you might want to add that to your reading list. Bucky is also asking, is there a source of asphaltum on Napa Valley? I don't know that I'm saying that correctly. ASPHELTUM.
Oh, asphaltum. Asphalt? Not that I know of. But asphaltum was used to, you know, applicate things to different types of artifacts, things like that.
And there's clarification on Stephen Power's work. It looks like it's Tribes of California, very Eurocentric, not scientifically reliable, just an FYI. So thank you for the share. Any other?
I was going to use, Kroeber, he cites and thanks Stephen Powers in his book, and I have read Powers, but I tried to stay away from it.
Okay. All right. So we have about 15 more minutes before Zoom turns us off. Feel free to ask any questions.
I had another question then. John, you kept referring to patterns, and I wasn't quite clear what you were talking about, whether you're talking about patterns of artifacts in the burial or patterns on the arrows. And so could you elaborate a little bit on how patterns are used to help you, to inform you about the history and the people?
Yeah, that's what I asked you guys to go get a drink, because it's an archaeological construct. So you have temporal periods right here. So you have Paleo-Indian, Lower Archaic, Middle Archaic, Upper Emergent. Now within that time scale, there's archaeological constructs based on artifact types. So San Francisco Bay cultural pattern, we have what's called the Augustine pattern, but it's different artifactually from other Augustine patterns. So the Emeryville aspect, which is the Emeryville Shellman, is the type site for it, is different. The artifacts from there in the late period, or lower emergent, are different from the artifacts up at the Clear Lake.
What you're talking about, just for us non-anthropologists, what you're talking about is the array of artifacts that are found.
The material culture. So there's common artifacts, and then there's differences. So like the bow and arrow, the projectile point types, the arrow types, are different, markedly different between the Clear Lake aspect of the Augustine pattern than the St. Helena aspect of the Augustine pattern. But yet that pattern is just a construct. So for as a way of organization,
yeah,
I suppose. And it didn't come out till, well, the first early ones were just early, middle, and late period, and that came out in 1936. There was a conference in Davis in the 60s where Jim Benioff, Dave Fredrickson, I forget the guy's name, but Pacheco, but there was archaeologists got together and said, hey, you know, it's not as simple as middle, late, and early. So they came up with a different construct, which has been developed, you know, over the years. So I didn't really talk about the Borax Lake pattern artifact types. Right? The fluted points are indicative of what we have here as a post pattern and stuff like that. So when you get up to into here with these patterns, the Haux aspect, and how that was identified at Lake 261 by certain, actually projectile point, lancelet points and things like that, and other artifacts as well. And then as you get farther north, and the Mendocino aspect of the Mendocino pattern is different than the Berkeley pattern. But you know, try studying this and trying to figure it out. But it changes, you know, as people you know, think about it, write about it more. There's a new kind of for the Bay Area. There's people have been re-examining collections and the artifact types, and then part of it too is that dating techniques get a little more refined. Then you're able to place, like the obsidian artifacts, there's what they call obsidian hydration, and you're able to place compare sites a little bit better.
Question for you from Jessica. Can you give an estimate to how many years the bedrock Acorn milling station at Skyline Park in Napa goes back? You know?
Well, no, I don't. What?
Okay.
But that's happened. You'd have to date the stuff around it. So there's probably datable materials around there that you could use. So it's by association. And
Okay.
that's one of the hard problems in trying to date bedrock milling sites, is that if there's no deposit around it, a lot of times they're on slopes, it gets washed away. Then you could say, oh, maybe it came in middle Archaic, upper Archaic, when the Acorn Economy, we think the Acorn Economy was, became more prevalent. But yeah, I don't know if you could even, I don't think you can even date the rock, but because the rock would give you the time it was formed, so you'd say a million years ago or whatever.
All right. Any other questions? She said, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
All right. Well, I do want to thank, I should have thanked everyone before they left. We were down to just about 30 participants. Thank you for those that are still here with us. This is great for our first lecture. There's so much to cover. There's so much to make up for. I was brought onto the Historical Society actually to open the Heritage Center in November. And so I am playing catch up as I become acquainted with the organization, and there's just so much we want to do. So we do hope that you'll subscribe to our newsletter and join us if you're not already members. Let's see. We have people saying very informative. Miriam shares that there's lots of residents that find arrowheads and even mortars. Is it legal to keep them? Great question.
Depends where you find them.
Right. Or depends whose money we use to find them.
Yeah, it depends whose money you use to find them. If it's on state, federal property, somebody else's property, yes, it's illegal. So if you went up to Bale Mill State Park, picked up an arrowhead, and you got busted, there's a good fine. Federal lands, same thing. You'd be prosecuted under the American Antiquities Act. Gets a little bit dicier when the issue is if it's a private landowner, because United States does not have like treasure trove laws like Europe or anything like that. So it's the landowner that actually owns the collection. And I think there was one court case that came up just recently where a landowner in the Midwest was allowing people to come dig on his property. He was actually shut down. He lost the case. So something like that, definitely. But the collection, it's not illegal, but is it just gonna? I mean, what do people do with them? I mean, I've seen driveways lined with bull mortars, and I think there has to be a certain appreciation of what the artifact means, who made it, who lived there. So I don't necessarily agree with collection. But having said that, some of particularly in the Bay Area, some of the earlier studies were by people who collected and kept good provenience on where they found it, and were able to use that in a scientific way. That's all I have to say. Probably said a lot.
Yeah, no, I think it's very much gray area. I think, I don't know, even on private property, I think the more I dug in the research before contacting you, John, it gets quite complicated here in California. But that's a conversation for another day.
I think there's a new law that was just passed that allows tribes more latitude in repatriation of materials to the tribe. The standard had always been, hey, you have to have a curatorial facility. It has to meet CFR 36, blah, 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 blah. But now we're actually, repatriating materials to tribes for interpretive purposes, things like that. exhibits. But there also comes with an appreciation of what that artifact is, whereas pot hunters, I don't think have that same appreciation. Okay.
Here's a question. I'm not sure if you're able to answer or willing or wanting to answer, right? Great question, Bucky. Do you agree we should do more to protect native sites? Vineyard work routinely destroys important artifacts every day. I'll answer, I'm a former, jokingly, I say I'm a recovering realtor, but I was a former realtor. And when I showed country property between Napa, Sonoma, and Solano and Lake counties, and we would come across some artifacts. I was the realtor that was always like, wait, stop, no, and take another step. Let's call the proper people and let's and so personally, yes, I believe things need to be protected. But, does everyone do that? Probably not.
Okay, I'm trying to remember, God, what was the name of the one? But anyway, we did surveys out on the east side of Napa Valley, right before it hits, I think, 28. There were some new vineyards going in there a few years ago. And we found some archaeological sites. And they were exempt from CEQA or any environmental laws because they were on slopes. It was gradients. And they weren't subject to, a lot of times in Napa Valley, if they're near the water course, they're subject to an Army Corps permit. So you have to do some type of preservation. But I remember, okay, so what happened was we found these two archaeological sites, and the vineyard owner, and it's one
Was this at Circle Oaks over there by Berryessa, just before you get to Berryessa?
No, this is farther down, right below Napa City.
Okay.
Maybe it's not 29, right before 29.
All right.
So what happened was that the landowner said, he got really excited. He had a couple Native American sites. So he preserved them, put the vineyards around them. It was great. And then it wasn't Stag's Leap. Anyway, Phelps Vineyard.
I was gonna say Joseph Phelps.
Yeah, it was Joseph Phelps. So they actually preserved the two archaeological sites. We went actually out and tested them, and one of them was a lithic scatter, and the other one was actual, amid the site stuff, and he preserved them. But he would also take, when people came to visit that vineyard, they would take him on tour. So we wrote a little history of. So that was, for me, was kind of a great way of integrating. Yeah, you can still have your vineyard, but integrating, that preservation aspect into, growing your wines. The other thing that does happen a lot, whoever asked the question is correct, is when you're putting in irrigation lines. And the restoration project we just finished, we finished a few years ago, from the Oakville to Yountville Reach. Oakville Reach? It was called the Oakville Reach. When they were moving the irrigation lines, they trenched through a burial site. And part of the agreement was to have a monitor, but they had already trenched through it. And there was, you could see it in the sidewall trench. And there we actually did a data recovery. We were able to do it, but we worked with the Wappo tribe to come up with a solution. And the landowner, I think, was much more aware. And also the workers weren't really trained what to look for. And they were just out putting it in the irrigation trench. So it does happen up there. But I think vineyards are much more conscious, you know what I mean? They're much more aware nowadays than they were, well, certainly at the turn of the century, or, well, what century? 19th century. But the 1970s, I think, was kind of a turning point where people started caring a lot more about, what they were doing with the land and stuff like that. And then the environmental laws. So I think when a new vineyard comes in, it has to be permitted and there has to be studies done. So.
Great. And Alvin just wanted to share that it's his opinion is that it's best to leave artifacts in place as the best case scenario possible. Absolutely.
Or just like if on a trail or something. I know I've come across a couple of artifacts too. I just move them out of like the sort of visual realm of other folks that would be passing through and whatnot. I mean, yeah, it's really a difficult decision at the end of the day, just to be like, okay, well, I'm just gonna chuck this thing somewhere else. And so, or just move it aside, or, you know, I think there's just a long history of just people take the stuff without context. And I think that hurts a lot of Native American communities just in the long term, because sometimes it's just nice to see your culture still living there in some essence. But when people displace that, I think that just disconnects you away from that as a Native person, I think. And so, as you know, the best case scenario, just leave it in place. But if you can't, just move it aside if you could, or whatever. And, you know, obviously sometimes.
Sorry, Aguilar.
Yeah.
It's just different. Yeah. It's on a case by case for sure. And, you know, that's just my 2 cents on that.
I mean, some landowners I've talked to have said, oh man, I didn't mean to do that. And we've actually had artifacts returned to us to give back because people started thinking about it and felt bad what they did. So
I think you offered a great response to the vineyards and how they interact. I was always curious about this. So I've done most of my work in Mesoamerica, and the past couple of years down in Southern California, and now here in the northern area here in Oakland and so forth. So I visualize like all these major impacts to archaeological sites. It's great to hear sort of your perspective, Mr. Holson.
Yeah, most of the damage in the valley floor has been done, and because that was developed first. But well, you know, Clear Lake was a good example. When Clear Lake kind of became the, you know, there's more wine production up there now than there ever was, and their environmental laws weren't as strong. They're stronger now, but you know, I mean,
would they be subject to the sequel 5024 MOU in some element?
Like retrofitting it back to when they developed?
No, not in the past. Moving forward, for sure. Most of them have to produce a CEQA document, and actually that's where we come in when we do our surveys and things like that. God, things like that, I gotta get over it after 60 years of saying things like that.
And just so you know, we may disappear here. We're coming up at 8:16, and I believe it was a 2-hour session. So if we lose you, I'm sorry, but this has been very informative and a good way to start some dialogue with people that I personally have not met yet. And thank you, John, for joining us. I appreciate your information. And do we have any last questions before we are turned off?
Just real quick, Alvin and Charlie, if you want to contact me, my email address is on the webpage for Pacific Legacy. I was interested in both your comments.
And you can also email me and I'll forward John's contact info if you'd like, Alvin. I don't know if you took down my email address.
Yeah, I took it down, and yeah, definitely a conversation would be great to have.
Absolutely.
So I'll reach out. Thank you.
Excellent.
Everybody else can email me too, but only 2 a day.
He's semi-retired here. So Stephen, I'll turn it over to you, Stephen.
All right, thank you. Thank you, John, for a really interesting talk. And thanks, Charlie, for joining us. We did reach out. We would love to reach out and continue to include Native American population in the society and informing us all. We have to start today. We can't overcome centuries of misuse and mistrust and abuse in one lecture, but we can certainly begin to open our hearts, as Letty said. So thank you. And thank you, Letty, for pulling us together. We look forward to more discussion, and we look forward to more active discussion with the entire all the populations who are part of the Valley history. So thank you all for being here. We look forward to the future.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks.